This is Brother Ron, and welcome to We All Be News Radio and TV, the news-free Dixie for the 21st century.
Thank you so much for hanging around. We're so fortunate to have two guests with us this evening. You'll welcome with me the director of the film, Nancy Buirski, who has premiered this film at the Venice Biennial as well as the New York Film Festival. So we are honored to have her with us this evening. And our very own, the Chair of Africana Studies and Associate Professor at Rhodes College, Dr. Charles McKinney. So we're just gonna hang out here for a little bit, have a little bit of a conversation, because that was a lot. What do you guys think? Yeah, right? So I think, Nancy, you and I had talked before we got started this evening. Let's just start with the title, The Rape of REcy Taylor. Kind of a loaded statement. What made you decide that this was the way you wanted to introduce this project to the world?
You know, I felt like REcy Taylor had been courageous enough to call what happened to her what it was. She said she'd been raped. And she was very courageous, not only to say what happened to her, but also to obviously call out her accusers. But she used the word, and I felt like we would be far less courageous if we didn't. I know that the word sometimes can act as a trigger, but I also know that it's a word that we should be able to talk about. We're trying to get this into the conversation more. We're trying to open this up and make people feel safer about talking about these things. It's never an easy thing to talk about, but I just felt like we can't shy away from these things. And certainly, you know, one of the reasons that people don't want to use the word in current day is that people associate shame with it. And that's the last thing in the world we want. So I just felt like it needed to get out there. And believe me, we got a lot of pushback. There are a lot of people that said we shouldn't use it, that we'll never get butts in seats. But we have gotten butts in seats, and we've gotten a lot of support for using it. So I hope that this is just the beginning of being able to use words like this and talk about these things in more communities.
Charles, what do you think about the historical significance? Can you give us context around the importance of using the term rape with a Black woman?
Sure. First off, this is a magnificent film. So thank you for that good work. When it comes to using the word rape for actually rape, right? You know, this is a testament to how reality gets bent when it comes time to talk about Black folks, right? REcy Taylor was raped, right? Period, right? But we got to have a debate about whether or not we want to call the rape of REcy Taylor what it was, right? She was sexually assaulted by 7 people. That's what happened, right? 2 + 2 is 4, gravity works. And this event happened, right? And so that's a testament to how hard it is to make our way, to see our way clear, to affirm the humanity of Black women, right? So, you know, so that argument, right, about whether or not we should call this that, right, harkens back to the reality of the fact that, you know, legally speaking, right, you couldn't rape a Black woman during slavery, right? Rape is a legal, that's a crime, and that crime is that assumes that a person who's been raped has legal standing, right? Black women don't have legal standing during slavery, right? They barely have legal standing in the years and the decades after slavery, right? And so, you know, so that moment, right, about how we want to call what we want to call this, right? That's a testament to how hard it is for us to see and affirm the humanity of Black women. And also it's a testament to the ways in which society conforms itself to white supremacy, right? The ways in which society conforms itself to deny Black women the opportunities to be seen, to be heard, to be affirmed, to be protected, and to be believed.
Absolutely, and we're going to have fun tonight. One of the things, Charles and I do this all the time, so y'all get used to it. I think all of us thought it was very interesting when Larry Smith, the local historian from Abbeville, said, you know, there were some cases where Black women, just going off what you said, back in slavery were raped, but, you know, there were a whole lot of consensual affairs. Can you give us a little bit more glimpse as to why that myth has continued and what that brings to the challenge of putting out a story like this?
I want to kick that to you. Just
I knew you were going to do that.
Yeah, I want to kick that to you. I've got thoughts, clearly, but I would love.
Well, of course, people want to know why we put him in the film in the first place. And I thought it was very important for people to understand that there is that mentality that still exists today. That not only Larry Smith, but those two brothers that are in the film, they are trivializing that crime. And the fact that they can use euphemisms, the brothers use euphemisms like, oh, they're just, you know, they just had too much time on their hands and all of that. They're not acknowledging that this is a serious crime. And Larry Smith is the kind of, well, I have to live in this town. He is not sure to this day that REcy Taylor was raped. So it's important to understand that this isn't just history, that this is happening today. And you know, I talk a lot about the kinds of movies I make which are rooted in history, but as far as I'm concerned, history ain't over. And that's what I guess I was trying to show by including them in this movie.
Amen.
Yeah. Charles, in a lot of your work, and for those of you who don't know, he has recently co-edited a book, An Unseen Light, about the Black civil rights movement here in Memphis. You talk a lot about counter-narratives and the importance of us putting out stories that challenge our current notions of history. And Danielle McGuire was really the historian with her book At the Dark End of the Street in 2010 to really bring this story, at least for scholars, to light. How does the counter-narrative, and particularly, I think since Danielle's work, this has more become part of the scholarly conversation, but I think, Nancy, this is the first step for it to become part of the public conversation. So could you talk a little bit about that? And then, Nancy, how do you think this is fit into other conversations today?
I mean, so many things shift when we have the nerve to center Black women in our narratives, right, in our stories. What shifts? Our notions of leadership shift. Our notions of political viability, our notions of organizing, notions related to, in this story too, we see this blurring of the lines in terms of this ideas related to nonviolence and self-defense, right? You know, I think that you know, the Taylor, you know, REcy Taylor's, the brothers in the family were like, right? You know, we're not going to sing Negro spirituals tonight. We're going hunting, right? For white rapists, right? And so that blurs the lines between, you know, these lines that have been drawn about, you know, this dichotomy between nonviolence, you know, the spiritually based nonviolence, and, you know, and angry, right, and angry, you know, Black nationalists who are into self-defense. No, this is what that looks like. My daughter was raped last night, right? And so when we center Black women in these stories and in these narratives, the other thing that we see is that we're reminded of, right, the realities of trauma, but also the central realities of violence, right? Violence is ubiquitous. It springs up casually, right? You know, there's a story that I read a couple of years ago about this little boy. He's walking home from school, and he's got to walk across the bridge. And there's these two white men fishing on the bridge. So he says, I can't walk across the bridge. I don't know what's going to happen. So he stays on the school side, curls up under a tree, entertains himself for a couple hours, goes to sleep, gets up the next morning and goes back to school. He didn't go home all night, right? So the next day, right, he goes home. So he's been gone for 2 days. His parents are beside themselves. Like, what happened? What were you doing? What was going on? He said, Mom, Dad, it was 2 white men on the bridge. And they say, oh, okay, you did right. Because you don't know what's going to happen if you cross these 2 white men fishing on the bridge. You don't know if they're going to let you pass, or you don't know if they will slit your throat and throw you to the bottom of the river. That's how pervasive, right, violence is in the Jim Crow South, or now, right? So we see that in the centering of Black women in these narratives. The reality of violence is reaffirmed. The trauma is reaffirmed. The other thing that we see here too is we're reminded of the ways in which society conforms itself to white supremacy, right? This is not a story about 6 mean white guys. That's not the story here, right? That's the beginning of the story. Then we have to talk about it and navigate the fact that the story is also about the state of Alabama refusing, right, to even have a trial. Does that sound familiar, right? We can't even get to the point where, you know, we can see Black people shot on camera and not get a trial, right? So again, we're also talking about these legacies with regard to the abdication of responsibility and justice, the legacies related to trauma, the legacies related to violence, but also the legacies related to resilience, right? You know, REcy Taylor says, I'm telling it all. And I'm telling everybody. And it's Alabama in the 1940s, right? I'm risking my life or the life of my family, but this has to happen, right? So with REcy Taylor and Rosa Parks and this long list of sisters that's dedicated at the end of the film, right? Long list, the long nameless list of sisters who stood up to this atrocity, who stood up and affirmed their humanity, right? All of these things are centered when we place Black women in the center of the story.
We can mic drop and go home. Just kidding. We still got some time to talk. Nancy, I think that what was interesting about how you chose to tell the story and the way that you approached the counter narrative to this was that you used race films, and you used director a lot of Oscar Michaud's films as a way to convey the depth of what was happening. Can you talk a little bit about how you chose those films and why you chose to put those in this project?
Sure. It was very important to me to communicate without being didactic in the movie that this happened to more than just REcy Taylor. And one way to do it was to look at the way stories were being told then, and what stories were being told. Well, if fiction filmmakers like Oscar Michaud, and you all know what race films are, they're made for Black audiences, Black casts, by Black filmmakers, in response to the way Blacks were being depicted in mainstream cinema during that period, especially, I said Gone with the Wind, of course that too, but Birth of a Nation. And the way they were depicted was quite demeaning. And so there were filmmakers like Oscar Michaud who said, we're going to tell it the way we see it, and we're going to show you multidimensional people on the screen. And living multi-dimensional lives, but these were still fiction. They weren't nonfiction, so they were drawing on themes that were important to them. So if you see women running constantly in these movies, and some of which are actually being raped, one woman is being attacked by someone who it turns out is actually her father. You have to appreciate the fact that those are the themes of their lives. That's what was going on, and what better way to show that it wasn't just REcy Taylor who had been raped, but these, many, many women. And the aesthetics of those films kind of, to me, elevated the story. Not that it needed elevating, but it kind of put it in almost an epic biblical sense that, we were looking at something far greater than one person. And that was always the challenge I had with this movie, that I wanted to tell REcy's story, and I wanted it to be palpable, but I also wanted to broaden it to a larger campus.
Just really quickly, I thought that was brilliant, the way that you used popular culture to talk about this. It's also a great reminder to show us how Black folks were dealing with and contending with these realities, right? Ida B. Wells, Memphis' own Ida B. Wells, right, our own freedom fighter, she would use photography to tell stories related to lynching, right? So she would use, she's got a series, really powerful series where she would stand in for the individual who had been lynched, right? And so for instance, for Tommy Moss, you would see in this image Tommy Moss's children, Mrs. Moss, and where Tommy was supposed to be, she would stand there, right, and say, this is the Moss family now, right, without Tommy, right? And so she used photography in this really powerful way. Caretha Mitchell, a scholar at Ohio State, has got this great book out called Living with Lynching, and it's about African-American lynching plays, right? What happens after somebody is murdered by a lynch mob? How did the family move on? How do communities adjust for that, right? And so she talks about, and she's unearthed out this series of lynching plays, right? That black writers and artists are writing and producing in the early part of the 20th century, right? And so then when you add on Oscar Micheaux's films, right, we see this really rich tapestry of Black folk trying to contend with, in a cultural context, trying to contend with the reality of rape, the reality of lynching, the reality of these systematic marginalizations, but also the pushback, right, that we see. Because in a couple of these films, right, the white man is not successful, right? Sometimes he catches an L, right? A knife in the throat or whatever, right? And so, again, we also get to see these depictions of resilience as well. And I think it's really powerful.
So another thing I really enjoyed about the film, I'm now officially a fan of the film, I'm tweeting this everywhere, was our expanded understanding of Rosa Parks. How did you come across this, and why did you make some of the decisions you made and how you portrayed her in the film?
Well, those of you who are scholars who've studied this all know that Rosa Parks was an activist. She wasn't just a tired seamstress who sat on a bus and decided she wasn't going to get up and move that day. But the general public doesn't. And you'd be amazed at how often I was out, trying to initially sell this film and raise money to make it, and I'd mention Rosa Parks, and they were flabbergasted that she had this role. So it gave me an opportunity to talk about how people were used as symbols. They're used as symbols in every movement, but particularly in these movements, the optics were so important. And even though Rosa Parks did want to get up and speak during that famous speech that Martin Luther King gave, and they said, no, Mrs. Parks, you've done enough for us. Right. She even understood how valuable it was for her to appear a certain way. I mean, you all know about the politics of respectability and all that stuff that went on. This was, the stakes were so high. And I think that the people who were organizing and trying to affect change, they understood they had to be strategic. And they had to get out there and put things out in the world that other people could absorb and take and not push back on. So this was one way of telling that story. There's so many themes in this film, and they come out not only in Danielle McGuire's wonderful book, but other books that have been written around the same time. This film could have been 10 hours long. So the challenge was actually to tell it in a story arc so that you really do feel the story, and yet you tap on some of these themes at the same time. That was a challenge.
And the thing I really appreciate about the film, too, is that you also show us the spaces where women are exerting, right? Black women are exerting high levels of agency, right? So in the wake of the REcy Taylor case, right? If that's a room full of men sitting around figuring out what's the next step, right? That's a very different trajectory than a trajectory of a room full of Black women thinking through and thinking about what the next steps are in this, in the wake of this sham of a court case, right? So, because a room full of brothers is frankly not going to pursue, right, a rape case without a hefty amount of from the sisters, right? That's just not going to happen.
Well, I think that I'm also trying to suggests that it's not just REcy Taylor's case where a group of black women organize and are catalysts. That was one case, but there are many others, and this all starts in the churches, and it starts in other community centers, and I'm not sure exactly why. I mean, Danielle's, her thesis is it happens because they're the ones who are being attacked. But there may be other organizational skills at play as well. But what we're seeing is a direct link between the way women organize and ultimately what happens in the civil rights movement. And we hadn't seen that link before. Again, scholars have seen it, but the general public doesn't know that.
Right. You're showing us the story before the story.
It's the origin story.
Yeah, right. And so for those of you who live in Memphis, right, we're familiar with the story of, the story related to Ernest Withers being the first African American cop here in Memphis in 1948. The story before the story, right, is the rape of two women here in Memphis and their mothers asserting and saying, "Oh, hell no. We want these their two daughters being raped by police officers," right? Who then organize to defend their daughters and to bring these cops to justice, right? And so that's the story before the story in terms of that's what takes us down the road of the Memphis Police Department saying, hey, maybe it's time for us to start hiring African American cops, right? So the way that story is told now is that's the Genesis moment, right? Hey, we got a black cop, woohoo, right? What's been locked off of that story is all of the organizing, right? And all of the, all of the organizing that's taking place in Binghamton, Binghamton, right? And other places in town, right? Related to the rape of these two young women, right? And the ways in which black women are organizing and mobilizing and actually fronting pastors who don't want to touch this. And they say, look, if you're going to be the leaders of the community, you need to handle your business, right? If you are going to say you are the defenders of black women, our women are being assaulted, and you don't got nothing to say about that, oh, well, we have something to say about you, right? And so you see, and so that's the other thing that you see in that moment, right? Where black women again organizing and saying, look, if you want to be leaders, black preachers, handle your business, do your jobs, right? And so again, the story before the story is so very important because it shifts everything.
We don't know how far back it goes. I mean, that's what's fascinating about history. That I truly believe that we should tell these stories as many times as possible through the lens of history, because feeling this large arc, this understanding that it goes so far back and things just don't pop up today is so important. People say that history repeats itself. I don't think it's ever over. And we have to understand that if it happened then, it's happening now, and it's not going to be over. We really have to pay attention to things that are happening now, because this is just going to be one link in a long chain, right?
Absolutely. So a couple things I want to highlight, because I hate moderating because I can't talk like I want to talk. But so one of the things that I find interesting when you're talking about that is the sexual politics of the time that we lose, that we think that people are talking about sex and sexuality in the way that we are today, and they're not. I mean, we forget that Lucille Ball in the 1950s can't say she's pregnant on television. So if that's the case, you can imagine what they're saying or not saying. So that's part of those dynamics. But in linking it to today, one of the powerful quotes that I think the professor from Yale said is that black women know that when they go to jail, they may not come out. And you didn't have to, Nancy, but you included a photo of Sandra Bland. And I think that was an excellent way for you to link it to the present day. And in January of this year, Oprah in her Golden Globe Cecil B. DeMille speech mentioned REcy Taylor. Can you kind of...
Well, she more than mentioned her.
Yeah.
I almost fainted. I didn't know she was going to talk about her, but she actually talked about her at length. Let's remember that this film, God for Serendipity, came out in the middle of the Me Too movement. I mean, we actually made the film well before it, and it opened a month or so before this whole business with Harvey Weinstein and everything. And what was painfully obvious is that black women were being forgotten as the Me Too movement was getting going. And I think Oprah Winfrey realized what an important oversight that was. Our film had come out, and then REcy Taylor had just passed away about 2 weeks earlier, so that there were obituaries about her as well. And I think Oprah was saying, you know, there is a woman, and she represents many other women who have been overlooked in this conversation. So I was thrilled. It was very important for REcy Taylor's legacy, and obviously to get people interested in the movie. You know, you mentioned the image of Sandra Bland. We actually, there's a split second where you see Michelle Obama at the end of the movie. We didn't want to be heavy-handed with the links to present day, because I don't believe in didactic movies if I can help them. I'd rather have the movie, I'd rather you be moved emotionally by what you're seeing and feel like you're being lectured to. But it is, you know, when you can just kind of suggest something without being heavy-handed, I think that's the way to go. So I don't have anything else to say about it other than it's just one of these instincts, and you say, well, not too much of that, but just a little bit.
Okay, well, so we've reached the end of our time. I know Nancy loves to talk to folks, and so she will be here to answer any of your questions, take a photo, all of that. So we'll stick around for a little bit afterwards. Thank you so much for coming out. We appreciate your support.
Like why wasn't like REcy Taylor more featured in the movie from her own perspective?
Because she was very old and she was sick, and so we only got a very short interview with her.
Okay.
So that's, I mean, her brother and her sister really spoke for her. But we couldn't use her anymore. That was all we had.
I'm glad
she was too tired.
Well, I'm glad you got that. Was she recognized by Obama too, by any chance?
No, only Oprah. I wish Obama had, but he didn't. I mean, I think he knows who she is by now, but I haven't heard from him, so I don't know.
But what about also, like, I was curious about the soundtrack. You opened up with Fannie Lou Hamer.
Yeah.
I know Fannie Lou Hamer, like, you know, Dick Gregory was a friend of mine. He said two of the most powerful forces in American history is the black woman and the black church. I thought it was interesting you opened up with Fannie Lou Hamer singing that powerful spiritual, because she got, you know, violated by the state without her consent. You know, they sterilized her without her knowledge. Then she got beaten to an inch of her life in a jail in Mississippi and Winona around the time they assassinated Medgar Evers. So, and Dinah Washington's from Alabama, one of my favorite singers.
Okay.
This
well,
Bit of Earth.
Dinah Washington.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so how do you choose the soundtrack for this? Like,
I just, you know, listen to it. I think about it. I knew the Dinah Washington song. I'd heard it before many times. I love that mix. It's Bitter Earth and In the Nature of Daylight mixed together. Fannie Lou Hamer, I love. And you saw her at the end of the movie.
Yeah,
she's in it.
Powerful.
And then I, you know, it's funny. I picked the music, and then I realized her history and how perfect it was. But I didn't look for it and say, oh, well, this is Fannie Lou Hamer's story. I'm going to use her music. I heard the music first, and I loved it.
Thank you, Sister Nancy. In the words, Duke Ellington, we love you madly. Keep on producing and pushing.